Now that I've got all the pieces of my mesh complete, I'm gonna go ahead and start creating UV templates for each of them. I never did do any of this stuff while I'm working for the most part, so it's usually a huge mess when I get around to it. The body is definitely going to be the most complicated piece to start out with. I just do a camera projection of the UVs just to make sure it's all one continuous piece, and then I can go through, find the edges where I think there should be seams, and then begin using the auto unwrapper to break those seams apart into separate shells. I couldn't quite decide where the seam should be on the hand. These are weird looking hands anyway, and that was sort of part of the fun with this weird approach to fingers, was trying to figure out how a strange shape of hand like that would work. And in a lot of ways, having less fingers did simplify the process, but it also meant that having one continuous piece, that piece was going to be a little deformed. Ultimately, it probably saved me a lot of work. Considering the timetable of this project, I maybe would stand by the decision of making the hands kind of weird, except I can't stand by it because it doesn't look good and nobody likes it. But it is what it is. I sewed the two pieces of the hand together right there, just trying to make that texture as continuous as possible. And of course, I'm going to have to do that for every piece of the body. Started out with sort of symmetrical pieces. I always thought maybe I would try and double my UV tile by overlapping everything that was symmetrical, and eventually decided that that just wasn't worth the effort. So one thing I did know is that these textures were going to be pretty simple, and I would prefer for the cylinders, the cylindrical type body parts, his arms, his legs, I knew I would prefer for those to be just rectangles. I'm mostly going to texture this using a Photoshop equivalent, so making those easy to recognize shapes, making everything straight lines, is hopefully going to save me some work down the line. It kind of looks like that optical illusion. Is it a face or two faces? It is. It was a face. Wait a second. It's a face. A vase or two faces. I don't know. I don't know what it is anymore. His neck is another cylinder. I tried to make that into a rectangle also. The face is nice and creepy to look at. Because he's got this huge chin, it's hard for me to make a seam up it without it being somewhat deformed. His skin tone should be a relatively consistent texture, so I'm not too worried about it. And then packing everything into a layout is just a matter of trying to maximize the space that you can get out of all those chunks, which is definitely the biggest challenge on a body, getting all those into one tile. Because the other pieces are less challenging, I decided to make it more challenging for myself by getting all of his accessories into one tile also. Largely, the automated layout tools make that a less intensive job, but it still involves going in and fussing around with everything. I wasn't happy with the arms not being rectangles, the legs not being rectangles, so I went back and rectangularized them as far as I could because there's some special topology on them. Of course, it can't all just be straight lines, but I can get pretty bored when I'm doing my UV maps, so sometimes I jump around between pieces and go back and revisit stuff or just move forward when I'm feeling bored of what I'm working on. This character is lightweight enough that I wasn't concerned with culling out the inside faces of all of these objects, so I just left them with thickness for the most part. The inside of the helmet, the inside of some of the armor pieces. I think the shoes are just one-sided, but the pieces of the shoes do have inner faces that won't waste. Most of these materials aren't going to have really complicated textures, so I'm not too worried about wasting UV space. There's a lot of stuff that can overlap. For instance, all of these rivets are going to have the same shape, the same texture on them, so every one of those is overlapping. The helmet might be the most complex piece outside of the body. And the lance comes down to a point, so it's kind of a cylinder until you get to the point at the end and realize that it's a cone. So that one doesn't quite come to a rectangle, but I unfolded it into sort of a triangle, and I think that will be sufficient for whatever the lance needs for textures. Really, I think I only even made the lance because it felt like he needed some kind of a prop to establish his identity. I'm not sure how much I will even end up doing with the lance. I don't really plan on making his mouth move either, so maybe the teeth are something of an empty statement. But it feels nice to have him there. It feels complete. All the pieces that aren't directly connected to his body mesh, that aren't part of that one continuous mesh, are going to end up in one UV tile. So that's the teeth, all the pieces of the armor, the lance also. And I think I'm getting pretty close to finalizing the layout of that tile in just a second here. There's all the pieces. It's roughly equivalent to all the pieces of his body, which is sort of a metric that you can use to tell if your character feels balanced. If his clothes are way more complicated than he is, then that might not be very balanced.